Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, the expression creative city is on everyone's lips. If there has been talk of a renaissance of the city since the 1990s, days of political, media, and intellectual debates, this is regularly linked with the concept of the creative city. From the widely discussed revitalization of Berlin's new Mitte district through the marked interest in Western European medium-sized cities such as Barcelona, Amsterdam, and Copenhagen, with their new urban districts, their focus on cultural industries and city tourism, and the cultural rebirth of New York after 2001, everywhere the urbanism of a European caste, which had been called extinct under the influence of suburbanization, appears to be re-establishing itself. And everywhere, creativity and culture appear to play a leading role here. So what are creative cities all about? It is the American sociologist Richard Florida who, among others, introduced the concept of creative cities, interpreted here as mainly a place for what he calls the creative class. In the following, I am assuming that the concept of creative cities points towards a very real transformation of Western and global city structures since the 1990s. However, the concept itself rather scratches at the surface. I would rather suggest that this fundamental change can better be described as self-culturalisation of the city. Here, cities increasingly see themselves in terms of culture. The interesting point here is that culture is no longer an observer category of social and cultural analysis, in the sense of the cultural, which it certainly also is, but a pattern which social reality, in this case the reality of the city in its different groups of protagonists, applies to itself. This self-culturalization does not remain limited to a supposedly consequence-free discourse phenomenon, but massively structures those social practices and materialities which what I would like to try in my paper is to outline this contemporary self-culturalization of cities as an ideal type. Fundamental for this new type is a form of cultural planning, which I will label cultural governmentality. In the first part, I will briefly treat the question of which social theoretical framework can be suitable for a cultural analysis of cities. Afterwards, in the second part, I will suggest a historical typology distinguishing between bourgeois city, functional city, and self-culturalizing city, before in the third section having a closer look at the 6 main components of this self-culturalization. After that, I will outline cultural governmentality as the central paradoxical form of planning of this new city. With some remarks concerning the social theoretical framework for analyzing the transformation of cities. What is a city? What are the characteristics that come into view when one describes and examines cities? In the context of the Chicago School of the 1920s and 30s, which was central to the sociological understanding of the urban, Worth defines it via 3 formal features: via the size of its population, social density, and social heterogeneity. In the city, the most varied milieus with a high number of participants gathered together in the smallest space. So this perspective is interested in particular in the phenomenon of social heterogeneity and above all in the form of social segregation, the spatial separation of social milieus. Urban sociology is then presented as its core, as an extension of the research of social inequality. Leaning on recent conceptual clarifications within the realms of the sociology of space and in cultural theory, among them Henri Lefebvre was of specific importance, we arrive at a more basic understanding of cities. Then the structure and transformation of cities can be examined above all on 3 levels interwoven with one another. A, cities as spatially arranged materialities. B, cities as social practices. C, cities as discourses and representational systems. A, as spatially arranged materialities. On a first level, cities are not just agglomerations of inhabitants, but specific structures of material artifacts which not only exist in space, but which form and reproduce specific spatial structures. Buildings, their exterior and interior architecture, traffic routes, designed nature, energy infrastructure, etc. Cities are social phenomenon with social density, then means that in an extended meaning of sociality, such as proposed by Latour, that they consist of subjects as well as of objects, of complex arrangements of people and things. Cities are to be reconstructed as specific spatial phenomena does not mean, in the sense of a container model of space, that they fill an empty, pre-existing space, but that they themselves produce spaces through the specific arrangement of material things and people. B, cities as social practices. Urban materialities and their spatial structure influence which practices are possible in them, but they are simultaneously produced and shaped by such practices of the users and inhabitants. His text, Walking in the City, Michel de Certeau, has given a cultural studies focus to the seemingly triviality of everyday behavior in the city, such as it had already had with Simmel and Benjamin. In general, the city consists of its utilization of the specific routines of dealing with it, which in turn structure and mark the space in the sense of what Giddens calls. The users make their city in a routinized as well as changeable way. This relates not only to the public space of streets and squares, but also to the semi-public space of shopping malls and department stores, offices and factories, venues of high culture, as well as clubs and scenes, ultimately to the private sphere of houses and apartments. These practices of dealing with the city have a simultaneously material and cultural character. On the one hand, they are solid, observable movements of human bodies, but at the same time, they are closely related to an implicit knowledge on the part of these users. Cities as discourses and representational systems. The practices in which cities maintain their existence thereby process through specific science, cognitive maps, images, and discourses of the urban in which the city attains a specific meaning. This ranges from the everyday symbiosis of the city, as discussed by Roland Barthes in Semiotics and Urbanism, in which particular milieus adopt their specific symbolic geography, through to the intellectual, artistic, media, architectonic, ultimately political planning urban discourses, the visions of successful urbanity, as well as the demarcation from the riskiness of the metropolis. Analysis of cities as social phenomena in their transformation thus basically must be concerned with the intermingling of these three levels: the discursive structuration of the urban, the social practices of its use, and the spatial arrangement of materialities. I can thus come to my main question. If cities can be examined as combinations of artifacts, practices, and discourses, how far do creative cities provide a new social historical type of a culturalized city? Here a detailed historical comparison would be necessary, but I can only briefly point out that self-culturalizing cities can indeed basically be distinguished from the two hitherto existing types of genuinely modern urbanity, from the bourgeois city and the functional city. We follow Peter Wagner's elementary distinction between three historical types of modernity: 19th century bourgeois modernity, the organized modernity between the 1920s and 70s, and high or post-modernity since then bourgeois, the functional, and the self-culturalizing city, so to speak, form spatial centers of the respective types of modern society. The culture-oriented city of the postmodern era only becomes comprehensible through its specific historic importance as a response to the crisis of the functional city before. Only briefly, some words to the two preceding types of the city. To what extent the bourgeois modern era relies on the city in the sense of the classic type of the European city has been examined by Max Weber in Die Stadt. The bourgeois European city of the 17th to 19th century, the strict dualism between city and countryside is just as fundamental as the distinction between public and private space as two complementary spheres of bourgeois life. Ultimately, its economic basis is in commercial capitalism, in the context of which the city is not so much a place of production than a place of commerce. The materiality of the bourgeois city is characterized by a concentration of the central functional locations of bourgeois life in its geographical center. That is to say, a concentration of the political, economic, and cultural functional locations. This urban center presents itself simultaneously as a space of public movements and encounter. The second half of the 19th century, the bourgeois city is put greatly on the defensive. The main cause of this gradual undermining is, for one thing, surely to be found in the unplanned consequences of industrialization and in migration from the countryside. Accordingly, the city advances to become an object of social criticism and of concern to social reformers. For another thing, as a result of its transformation from the trading and administrative city to the metropolis at the end of the 19th century, the bourgeois city is also put on the defensive at the level of cultural representation. Aesthetic avant-garde movements engage in a new glorification of the urban. But this urban is no longer that of bourgeois public life, but relates to an urbanity of aestheticized spaces. Public life of the city here is not one of civil communication, but that of the publicly visible, of a visuality that can be experienced aesthetically. In a dual, unplanned process in which the metropolis and the proletarian industrial city are superimposed on the bourgeois city, it thus becomes an object of triple reinterpretation, which it loses its bourgeois legitimation at the beginning of the 20th century. In the socio-critical interpretation of the city as a place of uncontrolled impoverishment, in the opposite avant-garde interpretation of the metropolis as a place of aesthetic attraction, thirdly and finally, in the conservative, culturally critical interpretation of the city in which that which appears appealing to the avant-garde is condemned in an anti-urbanistic way. Urbanity is a place of moral decay and of the breakdown of order. The response to the reality and to the model of the bourgeois city is the functional city, which from the 1920s through to the 1970s not only dominates the discourse around urban planning in the West as well as in the socialist society, but also, at least in part, is implemented as a new urban reality. The functional city provides the spatial material counterpart to organized modernity, to a modernity of technical social organization, of production processes in large corporations, and of mass consumerism. Economically, the functional city is not one of commercial capitalism, industrial and administrative city. The fundamental problem to which the functional city sees itself as a radical modern answer relates to the organization of working and living for large masses of people, and thus the new creation of urban order. The central principle of the functional city is the separation of the spheres of working and living. In this model, the standard of living and the quality of life for the masses require a strict spatial shifting of housing and living out of the inner city. The material reality of the functional city is still just as present in today's Western cities as that of the bourgeois city. However, just like the bourgeois city at the end of the 19th century, in the 1970s, the functional city falls into a crisis of legitimation too. Once again, two factors independent of one another cross here. One unintended consequence of the establishment of residential suburbs, above all in the form of American suburbanization, is the decline. The second line of delegitimization results from a critical urban discourse and a countercultural occupation of the inner cities, which begin in the 1960s and 70s in connection with the student movement, which interestingly adopts elements from the emphatic discourse on urbanity amongst the avant-gardists of the turn. Thus, the culture-orientated creative city, as it has taken shape since the 1980s, in many respects represents a response to the crisis of legitimation of the functional city. What are now basic characteristics of this new culturalization of cities? By using the term culturalization, I would like to describe a diffusion of those practices which reflexively refer to signs and symbols. Of course, the social world, encompassing the world of the urban, from the point of view of the observer in cultural sociology, always necessarily demonstrates a basic cultural character insofar as here signs and symbols are applied. The phenomenon of social self-culturalization refers to a specific constellation. Here, social practices are not only cultural, they understand themselves as cultural. In the process of the culturalization of cities, these signs and symbols themselves become more and more the object of practices. They become the object of a purposive and massive production. The everyday use of things is increasingly triggered by the aspect of the semiotic. Culturalization thus means a self-culturalization of cities. Here, 6 components are of specific importance. A, the establishment of a new urban art scene. The artistic activities of the participants in the postmodern art scene are considerably broader than it was the case for classical bourgeois art, and they also extend beyond Adorno's cultural industry. They are most strongly orientated towards the creation of visible products or products that can be experienced, which have a performative character of public representation. The participants in the art scenes see themselves often as neo-bohemians who keep a distance from the middle classes and open up their own city districts in the culture-oriented city. This has already been examined classically by Sharon Zukin in relation to the New York loft apartments in Soho of the 70s, and more recently by Richard Lloyd in relation to Chicago's Wicker Park. Such urban districts close to the inner city, frequently formerly socially disadvantaged and now restored, advanced to become the living and working space of this art scene. B, creative industries. The culture-oriented city is the primary location of those expanding occupations and enterprises which essentially engage in symbol production, the so-called creative industries. This field includes old and new media, consultancy, advertising, research and development, tourism, design, fashion, and so on. The symbol-producing economy provides the economic basis of the culturalized city. The creative cities are the primarily occupational field of the post-materialist middle classes, and the enticement of the creative industries into the city forms, as Florida aptly describes it and engages in it, a central objective of municipal cultural government. C, a consumer culture which follows Pines-Gilmore's model of experience economy. The fact that cities present themselves as primary places of the presentation and acquisition of incredible accumulation of goods of the capitalist economy also applies for the bourgeois as well as the functional city. Characteristic of the culture-oriented city is, however, the offensive reshaping of the city centers into showcases of consumer opulence, in which the act of buying goods and the presentation of the goods as carriers of particular aesthetic styles become part of an experience economy. The consumer-related range offered in the culture-oriented city furthermore becomes an incentive factor in postmodern urban tourism. D, musealization and eventification of high culture. Culture-oriented city reaches back to bourgeois high culture, but in doing so, it transforms it in a very specific direction. Here an expansion also of the classic cultural events of high culture, of theater, dance, concerts, literary readings, and not least of museums. Musealization provides a characteristic example here indeed. In the 1980s, a boom in musealization began, which focused in the cities on creating new museums for fine art, but beyond that, created a wealth of museums for and about local specialities. A culturalization takes place here in the sense that the sphere of what is suitable for museums, that means what appears significant enough to have a symbolic quality and to become an object of gaze, is massively increased. Furthermore, it is characteristic that they, in contrast to the permanence of classical bourgeois high culture with its permanent collections, repertoire theaters, etc., now frequently take place in the form of temporary and therefore changing events. E. Aestheticized districts of the city. Already in the mid-1960s, this process of aestheticization of city districts could be observed in parts of London and New York. Early on, it was summed up by the suggestive term gentrification. The concept of gentrification remains very selective, however, since it foregrounds the element of population exchange and gain in social prestige. But also of importance here is the transformation of the materiality of the corresponding urban districts, of their symbolic content and their utilization practices. The restoration of old buildings can be understood only against the background of a change in the aesthetic sensitivity from functionalist modernism to a postmodern aesthetics of the everyday. Jameson still aptly defined this with the terms of nostalgic mode rétro and historicizing prestige. For their uses, the gentrified urban districts are aestheticized to an extent that was not conceivable for the functional, semiotically comparatively thin, and explicitly anti-ornamental urban landscape. Of central importance for the aestheticized inner city districts is that they do not form purely residential districts, but at the same time are districts with expanding leisure and shopping opportunities, and in part also with work locations of the art scenes and of the creative industry. Point, solitaire architecture, that is to say, the spreading of spectacular architecture which tries to secure urban individuality. For the culture-oriented city, it is characteristic that since the 1990s, it has backed spectacular individual buildings, which each follow an individual style as distinctive as possible. The so-called postmodernist architecture of the 1970s, with its main characteristic of combining various historic and geographic architectural patterns, has by no means come to an end here, but quite the reverse. It is only since the 1990s that it has supplied on a broad front the stylistic background for a wealth of urban solitaire. Architecture has then itself become a cultural resource of the city. 6 processes which I have enumerated now combine with one another and together contribute to urban self-culturalization. The city as a place for the production of those signs, aesthetic in the widest sense, which come out of the art scenes and are launched into the world by high culture. Cities as a place of those more profane meanings and symbolic products which the creative industries bring forth and which are received in the ubiquitous consumer culture. And finally, the city as a place of those signs and symbols which are produced by the aestheticized urban districts and solidaire architecture. This culturalization, however, is not a completely self-evolving process. Instead, it is closely linked to a historically extraordinary type of political planning, which I'd like to illuminate a bit more in detail. Since the 1990s, a new discourse of urban planning sets in, which is combined with corresponding planning practices. Apart from Richard Florida, the texts by Charles Landry, for instance, The Creative City, a toolkit for urban innovators from 2000, are of specific interest, forming the background of quite a few urban planning activities throughout Europe and Northern America. Now, the fact that cities become the object of purposive political planning was already characteristic of the functional city in the first half of the 20th century. However, here we come across quite a remarkable difference between the two opposing types of political planning in organized modernity and postmodernity. Planning of the functional city, as it culminates in the 1920s in the planners' visions of Le Corbusier and Wright, and as it from then until the 1970s is manifested in both Western and socialist urban development, constituted a planning regime that wanted to build up the city afresh from the bottom up, to set it, so to speak, into an empty space, to foresee its infrastructure, its urban districts, and finally also how it would be used. If we draw upon the vocabulary of systems theory in Niklas Luhmann and Helmut Wilke, we can detect here a sort of first-order planning, Steuerung erster Ordnung in German. First-order planning is a kind of social control which assumes its object as passive, empty, and without inner dynamics. It is an engineering model of steering similar to designing a machine. In comparison, the distinctive features of the new form of planning, cultural planning, that's a term used by Charles Land, they emerge in the 90s becomes evident. Here two elements are characteristic. For one thing, the city now is no longer assumed as an empty, passive space, but as a space evolving in its own dynamics, as a social entity structuring and controlling its own processes in an irreducible way. The external control by politics then always sits on top of an existing self-control. Simultaneously, this urban dynamics is envisaged from quite a specific point of view, in terms of culture, more precisely of dynamic culture. It is exactly here that the self-description under the label creative cities sets in. In principle and theoretically, the object of planning and control could be observed quite differently, depending on historic specific discourses. For example, as individuals with interests, as an economic market, or as milieus of the social. But in the postmodern form of urban planning, culture makes the center of the vocabulary which is used for describing urban reality. Understood as a process of culture, here the city appears as a site of ever-evolving signs and symbols. From the political point of view, these processes exist already before and without political intervention, but through so-called cultural planning, they are to be intensified and focused. This is the case for the art scenes just as for architecture or aestheticized neighborhoods. Here, two political strategies are combined with one another, enhancement and distinction. On the one hand, the production of symbols is to be enhanced and increased, for instance, in more creative industries or additional aestheticized neighborhoods. Culture in the sense of meaning production here forms an unequivocally positive, emphatic target without limits or taboos. On the other hand, we find a systematic tendency to create local distinctiveness, that is to say, to establish symbolic differences in comparison with other cities, an interest in the production of individuality qua distinction, which contrasts sharply with the planning of the functional city, which was orientated towards collective, homogeneous patterns. The city works towards being and becoming distinguishable, distinguishing itself clearly and visibly as a place from other places. Culture-oriented planning of the city in the manner of the creative city thus follows the pattern of second-order control in the terminology of Luhmann. It is a control of something which controls already itself independently. It is remarkable that this interpretation can be combined in a useful way with Foucault's concept of governmentality. As we know, Foucault summarizes under the concept of governmentality a form of political steering characteristic of advanced liberal forms of government. In his words, it's a government of self-government. Instead of the mechanistic vision of fresh planning in an empty space, just as the control of bodies in classical discipline, we have in Foucault's governmentality the idea that what is to be planned is already irreducibly present and has a considerably dynamic of its own, that it already controls itself in an unpredictable way. The external control then always sits on top of an existing self-control and takes the form of, as Foucault puts it, incentives and deterrence, of regulation of the given instead of input-output processes. In our case now, this governmentality takes over the form of cultural governmentality. This cultural governmentality thus does not correspond to that neoliberal governmentality which has particularly interested recent governmentality studies, even if the two surely overlap. If there the object of society is thought of in terms of self-interested individuals and constellations of the market, then it is here as an essentially cultural ensemble of science, practices, and subjective competences which make up the internal dynamics of cities. Cultural governmentality, as we find it in the form of the self-culturalization of creative cities, thus is based on a paradoxical constellation. That which is planned must already be present and is unplannable in the strict sense. Self-culturalization, a reflexive production of signs and symbols in work, in living and leisure, must already have taken place so that now it can get into the side of the state. Cultural governmentality refers to a culturalization which has already begun without its contribution. When we come back to all 6 elements of contemporary urban self-culturalization which I've just mentioned, they all exist already before and without political control, and simultaneously they all become objects of cultural planning in the direction of enhancement and the production of differences. Thus, concerning all 6 mentioned elements of self-culturalization, the effects of politically motivated cultural governmentality are combined with the effects of 3 different collective agents of culturalization. First of them is an economic culturalization triggered by a symbolic economy which has shifted its focus from technological innovation to that which Wolfgang Fritz Haug labeled aesthetic innovation. The second collective agent of culturalization is the post-materialist urban middle classes who since the 1970s interpret cities increasingly as cultural spaces for aesthetic everyday experiences, a culturalization which at first largely profited from the critical urbanism of the 70s. A third collective agent of urban culturalization finally provides subcultural scenes, aesthetic subculture, partly also influenced the middle classes. The self-culturalization of the Western city thus turns out to be an overdetermined product of all 4 collective agents which are not reducible to one another. In each case, all 4 instances form complicated causal mixtures. The self-culturalization of the Western city thus is taking place within this square of 4 collective agents of culturalization, which immanent contradictions would deserve closer scrutiny. I come to what is the outside, the constitutive outside of the self-culturalizing city? Is there beyond the subtle differences, the fine distinctions between the individual self-culturalizing cities, between Copenhagen and Stockholm, between Frankfurt and Stuttgart, between Seattle and San Francisco, a fundamental antagonism from which the culture-oriented cities as a whole demarcate themselves? The other is evidently the non-cultural, that is to say, that which does not see itself as cultural, or of which culturalization is not accessible. For indeed, under present conditions, not all cities are culture-oriented, and not all city districts within them are so. The constellation of urbanity is admittedly currently normatively centered on the culture-oriented cities, but it also includes their specific peripheries. The fundamental opposition now turns out to be that towards those non-cultural cities and city districts. This involves above all 2 groups. In the Western societies, this relates above all to industrial cities from the face of the late bourgeois or of the organized modern era, which so far had not been subjected to a successful cultural government. Frequently are also labeled shrinking cities on account of their decline in population. Outside the West, it relates to those megacities which were never themselves functional or bourgeois cities, which lack the 4 mentioned collective agents of culturalization and which rather experience unplanned growth, which are not subject to town planning. Representatives of cultural planning, such as Florida and Landry, do propagate the idea that potentially any city can become a creative city. It must learn to exploit its cultural resources. One could, however, rather suppose that the effectiveness of creative cities is based not only on the fact that they demarcate themselves from one another, but more fundamentally that they distinguish themselves against a broad background of cities that are not able to self-culturalization. Constellation in the field of cities is to be understood in a similar way here, so it seems, to an apparently quite different era, that of the postmodern governmentality of the self. Many critics have observed that the self, too, is meanwhile urged towards a self-culturalization as a creative subject which sees itself as an individual carrier of a personal style. If the imperative of being original is directed at everyone, the actual antagonism turns out to be that between those stylizing themselves diversely as individuals and those who fail to achieve a harmonious stylization, who do not develop and demonstrate any special feature, or at least not valued. The situation of the postmodern urban landscape appears analogous here. The actual difference in the global landscape of urbanity obviously lies between the culture-oriented cities with their successful culture-oriented governmentality and those for which this self-culturalization appears beyond their possibilities. The model of the self-culturalizing city lays a claim to generalizability which it is hardly capable of ever redeeming. At the beginning of the 21st century, thus it seems that culture has indeed become a central weapon in social struggle, but here not in the form of a battle of cultures, but in a battle between successful self-culturalization and its failure. Thank you very much.